Hey everyone, I'm excited to welcome back Daniel Marsh-Patrick here. We're going to once again dive into Deneb and show a very interesting use case to build out another custom visual, one that you might have seen in my Google Analytics report. The visual that I've built, though, however, has a couple of different components and a few missing features, so I found it to be a really good use case, and the one that I built was actually inspired originally from this kind of cool combination that Daniel, that I'd seen on one of the things that was published kind of as a Deneb template to begin with. So I really like both the visual, but I like the fact that this is servicing a couple of performance and I'd say cross-filtering requirements that can't actually be met by combining native visuals. But first off, I just want to say thanks for coming back on and doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Reed. It's always lovely to come back, and I always like getting these fun visual challenges to have a look at. This one was particularly cool. I
Yeah,
say that
yeah.
about every. They all get progressively cooler, I guess.
Um, Now, before we dive into the demo, just as a quick reminder, who was was it you who originally created this template, or was it somebody else using Deneb?
I think there's a few cropped up, but I know I did one with Charticulator when we did Charticulator
Mm-hmm.
originally, and then as part of the intro to Deneb, I ported that across. And I
Okay,
think there's a
gotcha.
couple of other folks. I see Kerry's got one. I
Mm-hmm.
think Greg for Enterprise DNA, he's recently published one as well. So I think it's a fairly common use case that these types of visuals can solve quite well.
I agree.
Um, so my one is based on one that Steve Wexler did, who has a book called The Big Picture, which I don't have on my desk, but it's in my cupboard. So I took my inspiration from him to produce mine because it's
Okay.
a really, really powerful visual.
I'm going to flip over and actually show people what we're referring to. So this is the one that
Of
I've
course.
built so far that we will be rebuilding using Deneb. But what I did essentially over on the left that you can see where Daniel's hovering over is it is a visualization that is the heat map that I've used in my Google Analytics report for a long time. I think it's a great way to show trends in distribution by day of week and hour of day. But then kind of the addition or add-on to this is that you have a bar total on the sides to actually show the actual size itself because the density and the color distribution is great for showing those in a heat map, but it doesn't really show necessarily quantity as well by comparison. So that's an easy way to have that. So that's actually three different visuals. You have a bar and a column chart plus the heat map that I've combined together and grouped. The one downside, though, to this, when I built that out, is there were a few limitations. Performance-wise, there are three visualizations on that page. So in general, as you just add more visuals, it does start to slow down the report just a little bit because it has to render those in browser sequentially, and that just takes a bit of time to load the containers. The other downside too is if you want to select one of those, any of the bars or columns, yeah, exactly. So um, cross filtering is something that can do to other visuals that you see under the page. However, cross filtering is not an available option from a visual to a matrix or a table visual in Power BI. So what would happen originally if I was to select any of those bars or columns, it would basically create that table and transform it to one row or one column only, even if you had show items with no data, just because it can't cross filter to highlight. So that was because of that, I had to disable the relationships so it didn't actually filter that to get it to work well. But Deneb can actually solve both of those. A single visual that can render all of that in a single container or frame. And also it has that ability to do that filtering because there's a single visual now doing that. So kind of my starting point was just to see, hey, can I do this natively in Power BI? But now we can upgrade it and kind of optimize it using the custom visual builder of Deneb.
Indeed, we can. And this one's an interesting one because it makes us think a little bit more about layout and composition and
Mm-hmm.
how the scenario you just talked about needs to work. Because we've got mixed granularities here. Before we move across, I'll just dwell on, we've got our matrix here. So we have one data point per hour per day. So we've got all there's horizontal and visual encoding here. But with the bars, these are an aggregate. Whoops, that's the wrong shape. These are an aggregate. So this bar here is a culmination of these seven individual data points as a separate
Mm-hmm.
visual. So even with a visual like Deneb, we have to think about how these things aggregate. So even though what we'll show you today is all going to be done in a single visual, we still need to think a little bit about how it's going to work. So
Exactly.
what I'll do is I'll just jump over real quick, actually, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And here's my one I prepared earlier. So this is not Reed's report. This is a very simple version, but the fields we're going to use are very similar. And I've just got a couple of visuals here just to show you. So this is Reed's version over here on the left, and as we can see, we've got our matrix, and we've got our bar for the sides, and we've also got our column for the days. What we have on the right here is the Deneb version, and this is a single visual, and we have the, we can see it pretty much cosmetically looks the same. So with Reed's one, we observe that we click on the bars and we don't get that filtering. With Deneb, we can do that. So we can click on a bar, we get the table highlighted, and we get our visuals cross-highlighting. And if we do the same thing with, say, a day, we get that sort of lovely brush effect across
Exactly.
each
Yep.
layer. So it's quite a cool thing to do, because as Reed said, it puts it into one visual, which means it's one query. From a performance perspective, it's a little bit nicer, and it means that everything's all lined up as well. So one of the challenges we have to do with these visuals here is we have to make sure that the bars line up correctly, and a few other things. So there's a couple of little quirks, and layering visuals is a powerful technique, but with visuals like Deneb and Charticulator, you can do the layering inside the visual, and it's still, to Power BI, it's a single box that you can move around on the screen. So from a performance perspective, it's a single query, and much easier to play with. And as we can see here, we've really just used the 4 fields. We've got our hours, which are down the side. We've got our weekday, which is across the top, and we've got 2 measures. We've got sentiment and messages. So hopefully I can explain this correctly, Reed, but you might be able to correct me. Is that
Sure.
the heat map here is encoding the sentiment values. So if we hover over the map, we can see the darkest one is about, I assume, 70%.
Yep.
And some of the lighter ones are about 50%. And I think there's one here that's, a little bit less. And the bars are the number of messages that we're getting.
Yep. Exactly. And with the goal with this is to kind of just, and that's one of the reasons that I chose a different color is they are different data points, but you can also you can choose to have them both be from the same data point, so a grand total of the same subtotal values, or you can show separate ones. In this case, it was sentiment, but also just showing you with this type of data that sometimes if you have a very small data set, that might be a reason why you have extreme highs and lows, is because it's a small pool size that you're pulling from. In this case, it was message analysis and sentiment from there. So it still gives you an insight, but the color helps to indicate that there's different data sets that it's looking at, but still related data in terms of the same fact table.
Yeah. So we're double encoding these bars here. We're encoding the length based on the number of messages, and the color is a shading similar to the heat map for sentiment. So we're actually getting 2 for the price of 1 here.
Exactly.
So I guess we should probably crack on with building it, huh?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's dig into it.
So this is this is not really Deneb 101, but we're going to run through a few things today that will probably help you a lot with how you might want to think about building visuals. So I've got a tab here which is very similar. We've got our visuals on the right that we can use for comparison. I've already added Deneb to the workbook, and I pretty much have it permanently pinned now. But if you want to get Deneb, you can go to the App Store, or AppSource, I should say, or the marketplace, whatever you call it, just like you would for any custom visual. So you can come in here, you can search. We can see that the visual is available. It's certified, which is lovely. So any visual you produce with Deneb has the benefit of being certified, and you would just add it to your report. So I've already got that added, so we won't go through that. The other thing we need to think about with the visual like Deneb, because it's so flexible, with a bar chart, we have buckets or field wells or whatever you want to call them for the axis, the legend, the values, because the chart is a known chart type. So with Deneb, we've got a single values bucket, and we've got to think about that like we think about a table. So what we pass in as a table, we work with inside the visual. So I have a table visual just on the left here. And what we'll do is we'll pass in the hours, so we can see that we've got 1 row per hour of the day. We'll pass in our weekday short field, so we can now see that this breaks out into 1 row per hour per day. and we've got our messages and our sentiment. So this doesn't increase the row count, but it increases what we have available. So this is the level of detail that we're working with in this visual. So, with a bar, there's less rows. There's only 7 rows here and a measure value. With Deneb, we have to think about this single query. Fortunately, we can. So what I'll do is I'll just add those in. So I've got my hours, my weekday, my messages, and my sentiment. So these are now part of the data set. And we'll go into the editor. So we do that on the visual header, click edit. And we have the ability to choose our templates. So because we're doing something a little bit, I have a template for this that I could load, but we're going to build this from the ground up. So we're going to cover quite a lot of ground today, but hopefully very quickly. So we'll start with an empty template and we'll click create. And this is largely unexciting because nothing's really predefined for us. So we have, as I say, we've got our data set just here on the right, and this is what we're going to use to build our visual. And at the minute we have just a binding to, let me make that a bit bigger. There we go. Is that okay, or do you want that a little bit bigger, Reed?
Let's kick it up about another 50%. Well, one more. There you go. Perfect. Nice and readable.
Okie dokie. Just move that across a little bit just to give us some room to read. So at the moment, what we have is a binding to the visual data set, which we need. And at the minute, there's just no mark in there. So mark is a graphical element. And what we can do with, the visuals we've done in the past, we've used probably techniques like layering, where we use the same XY coordinates and put new marks over the top. What Vega Lite has, because we use Vega Lite, and this is the Vega Lite website, if we look down in the documentation, we have this area here called view composition. So we've got what we call facets, which are like small multiples. We've got layers, and we've got what we call concat. So concat means to concatenate. So that's basically stick things together. And we have horizontal and we have vertical concatenation. So the way we're going to think about the visual, we'll just go back to Reed's report for a sec, is we need to think about this as a grid. So we've got 3 visuals in here, but we need to think of it as a 2x2 grid. So this is our whole visual, but we need to think about, we've got a dividing line here and a dividing line here. So this is how we need to think about our layout system. So with some visuals, we might layer them over the top, and this one over here is a good example where we might use tricks to display bars at in the same space. But we're going to produce one visual in here and another one here and another one here. So this is how we need to think about our approach. I'm going to wire up some boilerplate code very quickly, which is why I just wanted to cover that off. So I'm going to delete this mark out, and I'm just going to type out my layout system. So I'm using a vertical concat because I want to start with my 2 rows. And I'm now typing out a horizontal concat, and I'm just giving each of these entries here a name just so that I can understand what they are. So I've got my main matrix. I've got, let me just put the auto apply on. And let's just zoom that in a bit. So this is not exactly what you just saw. And let's just tidy that code up. So let's break it down. We've got a vertical concatenation. And in that vertical concatenation, we have 2 repeating elements. So we're saying, use the line, son. Press the right key. Should have pressed shift rather than capital R. It happens when we're not looking at the keyboard. So this vertical concat is basically creating 2 entries, one here and one here. And when we break out our vertical concatenation, inside this first one, we have a horizontal concatenation. So what we've done is I've used this name property just to help me to understand which one is doing what. So I've called the first one the main matrix. So for the minute, this is row 1, column 1. This is the main matrix. It's not very matrixy, but we'll get there. And then row 1, column 2 is the marginal bars for the row. And then you've got your row 2, column 1. So we've got that. Sorry, just because I can't. I have a big problem with zoom it and drawing at the same time as annotating. So I have to kind of retread my steps. So this is our column bars. So Right now, we just see 3 squares, and that's because each row that's in our data set is being superimposed over the top of the other one. So there's actually um, 24 rectangles here, and there's 7 rectangles here, and there's, can't do the math right now, but however many that times that are here. So we're going to start working on making this look more like what we're actually working towards. So the other thing I'm going to do, just for simplicity, is we have our config tab, and in our configuration, we have a whole bunch of styling type stuff. And we put this in to help you with some of the configuration elements and understanding how flexible that is. But for simplicity, I'm just going to get rid of this for now. And we don't need auto size either, because with these concatenated views, we have to be quite prescriptive. This is one of the downsides. They're not responsive and stretchy, but we can improve that as we go. So I'm just going to just leave this at 2 things. I've got my view, which is my draw area, and that just turns off any grid lines around the actual chart, which we don't want. And I'm just using the default Segui UI font, which is what we use in a lot of Power BI. So we'll just leave that fairly simple for now.
Excellent.
And we've now got our simple layout system. So what I'm going to do, I've drawn a rectangle mark, and I've drawn a bar for the rows and the columns. Now, rectangles and bars are very similar concepts, but they just have slightly different behaviors. So what we'll do now is we've done our repair and format. We will add our encoding. So what as I say, we've superimposed our rectangles and bars because we don't know what data they're bound to right now. So in our concatenation here, we are we've got our rectangle mark, and we're going to start encoding our data. So let's go. So in this layer, I'm going to add an encoding, and I'm mapping my X coordinate to the weekday field, and my Y coordinate I'm mapping into my hours, and we can see that this is starting to explode out. So we've got our row now, which is mapped as well using the Y. And for our extra thing here, we've now got our X mapped to weekday. So let's just recap that very quickly. We've added encoding.
Perfect.
For the X coordinate for our first chart, we've bound it to the weekday. So we can see that we've got Friday, Monday, Saturday, Sunday. Now this is sorted alphabetically. Bear with me. We've got our Y channel, so our vertical position is bound. And we can see again, that's 1, 1, 10, 10. This is all textually sorted. So again, bear with me for a second. With our row, we only need to make these break out by the hour of the day. So again, we've only added a Y encoding here, and we've mapped that to our hours field. With the columns, we only want to map that out horizontally. So we use the X channel, and we map that to weekday. And we can see here we've got Friday, Friday, Monday, Monday. And again, that uses the same sort order. So we've got a couple of options with sorting. We can actually pass in, because custom visuals, particularly ones like Deneb, it's hard to get the sort by columns without adding them to the visual data set. So we could, if we wanted to, we could add in our weekday number, which is our sort column, and our hours column, which is our numeric column, and we could prescribe that as a sort order. But fortunately, because we've built this in a fairly straightforward way and those columns already work, we can actually defer to how they were passed in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add for each column, I'm going to pass in a sort, and I'm just going to turn that off. What this is basically saying is turn sorting off and defer to how it was actually passed in. So in this case, because the table's sorted sensibly for us, we can see now that we've got our Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because that's how Power BI has passed it in. It respects that sort by column. So in this case, I can take advantage of that. So I can go, I've still got my Friday here and my Wednesday here, so I can go down to this one, and I can do the same thing. And we can now see that it's Monday, Monday, Tuesday, Tuesday. So we've now got it sorting in what we call an ordinal way. So this is a way that, for us, days of the week, they don't sort alphabetically, they sort chronologically. So we've actually got that in there now. Now, we can use the same trick with the hours, because in our table, it's sorted by hours by days of the week. So our table's quite nicely sorted. So we can just use that. We can turn sorting off and tell Vega Lite that we don't want to do that. And we can see now that we've got 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we loop back into the PM. This one is still wrong. So we just fixed that one up as well.
Okay.
So we can now see we've got 12 and 12 and so on and so forth. So in this case, it's worked out quite nicely for us. It doesn't always play that way because we're building visuals in a more basic way. So we're not relying on the thoughts of a developer or somebody else to do the sorting for us. So sometimes we have to actually manually add these columns, but we're okay for now. So the other thing I want to do is, I've got my 12 a.m. here and my day of the week here. I don't really need to repeat it here and here
Yeah,
because
fair.
we saw from Reed's visual that it was inferred. So the other thing I'm going to do is for each of these bars, I'm going to turn these axes off. So we're in the rows at the moment. So we'll just add an axis null as well. And we can see that's just turned it off. So now we've got this nice, we can read across and we can understand roughly what the position means. And we'll do the same thing with our values here. So now our axis has disappeared and we're left with 7 shapes and 24 shapes. But we can understand the grid system and we've made that redundant info go away. So the next thing we really need to do is to think about, we cleared out a lot of this configuration. But what configuration lets us do is apply some styling aspects or move some of that logic into a dedicated place. And so we can see that and maintain it separately. So let's start fixing some of this up. And we'll type a bunch out. And you'll start to see things change as we type. But we'll finish typing everything in. And we'll recap as we're done. So I'm just typing in a few things here. And let's get this done here. Domain, yeah, because domain we want to do. And we'll just sort the x-axis out as well. So that's all done. So we sort of saw things unfold as we were typing because we've got the auto apply on. I'll just repair this so it's a bit. It doesn't change it much, but let's walk through what we've done. So firstly, what we did was we applied what's called band padding. So when we talk about band padding, that's the amount of spacing we put between things. So we added a 5% spacing. So if we were to set this to say 0, we can see that we get that everything tightens up.
Yep.
So there's less, we could zoom in and there's not much spacing between things. But if we change that back to say 5%, things start to open up just a little bit and we can start to resolve visually the data points.
Especially helpful when the colors are really similar.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're gonna improve this a bit more as we go. We're just trying to sort of build things up. Padding we've turned off. So what padding is the amount of space around the visual border. So if I were to put that to say 10, we can see it gets pushed away from the edges. So what we want to do is, because it's quite an info dense visual, we want to make as much use of the canvas as we can. So I'm just reducing that down. And then the other thing is we can increase or decrease the spacing between these concatenated plots. So these rows and columns that we've built to append our plots together. So, again, I could change that to say 10. No, that's the padding. Let's go down to the spacing. Watch where the cursor is. We could change that to 100 and we push the bars out away from the visual. But we want it something small. So 2 is just enough for us to resolve. And again, as we start to go through the design, this will make a bit of sense. So what we've done with the axis, and this axis property is all axes in the visual. We've turned off the titles because for us, 12 a.m. and the day of the week is quite intuitive, so we don't need that. So let's free up some room. We'll make the font a bit bigger, so again, we can customize that. If we wanted, we could make it 8. And it would be, we saw those days of the week are easier to read, but when we look at the visual on the page, that's probably a bit small. We're zoomed in at the moment. If we zoom out 100%, we can see that they're readable. But if we made them say 8, they're quite tiny.
Yep.
So we've got to remember when we're doing detail work, we may be zoomed in, but we've got to think about what it looks like at 100% zoom. Our label padding moves the axis labels nearer or further away. So again, I could make that say 50, and it would push our plot away from our axis labels. So this is just about enough white space to make sense. We turn off the ticks. So the ticks are like the little lines on the axis. We don't need those. our domain, this is the interesting one. So domain is the line along the axis. So we've enabled this. This is if we look at reads, read likes this black line along the sides. So
Mm-hmm.
we're actually enabling. Let's just zoom in. We're
Mm-hmm.
enabling our domain line along the axis, and we're setting its width to 2 pixels. So we have, we've got options here. If we wanted, we can make that 5 pixels. We can make it 10. We can actually control quite a bit of the cosmetic elements of that. We're giving it a black color, and again, we could make it, like yellow if we wanted. Don't know why we would, but we could.
Yeah.
And the cap of the line is square, so it's usually round. So again, we just flatten it off. So there's quite a deep level of configuration that we can apply. It's quite nice. The other thing we've done is we've gone specifically to the x-axis, and we've set the labels to be 0 degrees so that they read horizontally. And at the minute, they don't make a lot of sense because they're all superimposed. And we've changed the orientation to the top. So by default, that's down at the bottom. And if we just change it to the top, Bakelite does all the work and works all out for us. So the next thing we need to do is make better use of this canvas and spread this out. So with the view, we can do what's called step height and width. So when we talk about steps, that's the space used by categorical data points. So you've seen with some bar charts, they stretch to fit the canvas, but what we can also do is we can say use a certain amount of space. So the visual doesn't shrink to fit, but the chart stays consistent if you filter and slice and dice. So
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to do is we'll add in some step values. And what we've done is we've put in a 20 pixel step for the height. So we could just as easily change that to 30 pixels, and it
Hmm.
increases the height of each data point. Now we can see that it exceeds the border here. So we probably don't want to do that. So let's put it back to 20 again for now. But by moving them out to 40, we've now spread them out just enough so that we can read the days of the week. And we've got a little bit of space for our bars at the top and the bottom. So that's quite nice. So we're starting to fill the canvas a bit more and use a little bit more of that. The other thing now, we've got something that's starting to look a little like our layout. Let's start encoding some more data. So one of the things we want to do is, this is a heat map. So we encode
Mm.
the color of that. So I'm going to find my main matrix. I've got my marks and my encoding section, and I've got my X and my Y values. So I'm just going to find the end of that. And I'm going to start typing in a fill attribute. So you can see as I type in my fill, I've mapped it to sentiment, and it changed color briefly because it thought it was a category, but I've then added in a quantitative or linear encoding. So it turns into a ramp rather than a number of buckets. And the next thing I've done is I turned off the legend. So let's
Mm-hmm.
just wind that back a bit. I could keep that on if I wanted. But it's fairly intuitive for us to have it off. So I've turned the legend off. And then the other thing we've done is we've applied a scale. And a scale is a way of mapping data values to physical properties. So with the case of a y-axis, that could be the width of a bar based on the physical width of the visual. But with a color, it's mapping a value of your data to something on a spectrum. So what we've said here is these are the colors that Reed uses in his conditional formatting. So his
Mm-hmm.
start color is this one, and his end color is this one. I could just easily change that to say black. Spell black properly. There we go. And it does the work to calculate the values. It might be better if we did it on the other color. Let's try it again. So we
Yeah.
can see a little more
Mm-hmm.
distinction there. So we can actually use ranges or discrete buckets, and Bakelite will calculate the intervals. So we can see now that this is actually starting to encode those sentiment values just by assigning it to the field, which is quite nice. So let's just
Mm-hmm.
repair that so it's a bit tidier. And now we want to work on these guys here and here, because at the minute they don't really mean anything. So let's have a look at our row bars. And right now we've got encoding, and we're just using the Y value to put it vertically. So what I want to do now is I want to add I want to increase the width based on what that number of messages. So in fixing up these areas, what we want to think about is this extra little bit of space we've got, and also the amount of vertical space they're taking up. So if we jump back to Reed's reference, we can see we're using the rest of the space, and they've got a slightly narrower width than the heat map. So the spacing is just a little bit bigger. So what we'll do is we'll find our row. And one thing I'm just going to do here is within each of these concatenations, these rows and columns, we can specify. So we specified step height and width for the matrix, and that applies to the bars as well. But with this particular cell, when I can type width properly, we're just going to give it a 75 pixel width. So what this is going to say is use the step height for the bars, but use this manual width of 75 to fill out the positioning. And with the columns, we might as well do that while we're here. Let's use the height. I really have some trouble with my eyes and my E's. That'll be about 35.
Okay.
But we've got a little bit of space to play with here. So maybe we could just go back to what we just did with our step height. Maybe change it to, let's try 22. I think 21 will probably work. I think we'll leave it there because we might want to put a title in. Let's just jump back. And if we wanted a title, yeah, that'll work. So if we want to use the whole space, let's just work on that basis. You can obviously fine tune accordingly. So we can see now, yeah, it's recalculated the space to fit the title, and we know that we're hitting the borders about right. So we've got the amount of space needed. So we'll go back to that marginal bars. And what we'll do firstly is we'll do two things. We're going to change the height of the bars within the space allocated to make that little bit of cosmetic tweak. And we're going to bind our measure to the width of the bar. So let's just pop that in. So we're adding our height, and what we're doing is we're specifying use 80% of the allocated space, or bandwidth as we call it. And then just down in the encoding section, we're binding our messages field to the x coordinates, that's the width. But what's quite important here, and this goes back to what we talked about before, so we need it to be quantitative, so that's rather than it being a bucket, it's a linear value. But what I've done as well is I've just typed in sum. And the reason I've done that is because when we built our table at the beginning, we talked about the grain. So the grain of the visual is we've actually got 7 data points in here. So if I were to take the sum out, it's quite hard to see. Let's just zoom in a bit.
Okay.
And get the scroll bars. It's still quite hard to see, Reed, but you might be able to see there's these little white lines. They don't show up too well, but it's an artifact of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 data points in here. Now these are adding up.
Yeah.
But it's actually 7
stacking.
marks. So it's stacking. And if we think about these as, you wanted that cross-filtering effect, when we click on a mark, it only looks at the mark we're clicking on. So it's not a single bar. It's only going to cross-filter based on, it's basically going to be the same as clicking on one of these squares. So the sum adds it all up and creates a single mark. So if we zoom in now, we can see that there's none of these artifacts there, and this is a continuous bar. Vega Lite has the ability to aggregate, which is quite cool. So sum is 1. We've got averages and means and medians and all kinds of stuff. So this now is starting to look a little bit more like what we got, and we can see we have an axis up here. So we'll sort that out in just a moment. Let's go down and do the columns. So again, we've got, and I'll do a similar thing. I'll use 80% of the bandwidth, and we'll jump down to our encoding. And this time it's the Y coordinate. And we can see that it's starting to come together. So we're doing a sum, much like we did before. But the other thing we did, and you could just see it pop in there, is, let's just zoom, I don't know if this will work too well. With our scale, which is what we used for our legend or our quantitative encoding, we're telling it to reverse. So if we delete that line, it's actually going to draw the bars as if they're coming up from the usual direction. So with bar
Okay,
charts, they
gotcha.
always pretty much grow from the bottom to the top.
Hmm.
We want them to hang off. So by adding that reverse in, they actually hang down, and we can see the zeros at the top and the 10,000 is at the bottom.
That was
So
only added,
now
in the last year or so to the column chart in Power BI, which was one of the reasons I was actually able to make this. 'Cause
yeah,
previously, like you could do it if you did a times -1 to flip the actual numbers, but there wasn't a way to flip the chart itself. So there was a few recent additions to native visuals that actually let me build out something that was, I would say, good enough to call it a production ready visual from my end.
yeah. But it's quite nice because we just say reverse and it works it out for us. So
Exactly.
conceptually, it's probably a very simple thing to do, but yeah, it's a neat property when you get hold of it. That it opens up all kinds of things.
Hmm.
So next, what we want to look at is our axes here. We've got, we know these bars, we can sort of resolve them without the need for the axes, and they're different scales as well. But all we really need to know is that, which is the busiest hour, which is the busiest day. And we can work that out just by looking at the bars. What's really nice about the configuration is we can get quite, we're getting quite granular. So we've said for the generic axes, do this stuff. For the x-axis, do this. But we can also prescribe what to do for different axis types. So not just an x or a y, but if we're using a quantitative or linear axis, we can actually configure its properties as well. So this is what we call a nominal axis, that this day and an hour. These are categorical axes, but these are linear. So we can actually say for the linear axis, turn off the grid, turn off the labels, and turn off the domain line. So now we've just got these bars
Okay.
that basically tell us what we want. So we're getting closer. We're getting closer.
Yeah, yeah.
What we want to do now, what's it, Reed?
I was just saying, yeah, like it's almost to the completed result.
Yeah, we're very close. If we jump back out, we've got something that looks quite good. We can tell what's going on from it. But what we need to do now is to think about the interactivity side of things. We want to have the actionability, and this requires a bit more work. So these are probably where. So with things like interactivity, it requires a little bit more work to set up. So with Deneb, we can do some things like, if I look in the settings tab, we can turn on a tooltip handler, and we can do context menu resolution, and we can switch on cross filtering, which is what we want to do. Tooltips are really easy. So what we can do with a mark is right now there's nothing happening. We can go to a mark and we can say tooltip true, the flag that we need to display a tooltip. So I can now hover over here, and what Vega Lite will do is it will pick up the things it knows about, and we will get Power BI and Deneb to display a tooltip. Now, we haven't done that with this one or this one. And the reason we don't do it for everything is because you might have some parts of your visual that you don't want tooltips for. So we just prescribe that ourselves. But what we want to think about is not just tooltips, but cross-filtering. So, if we jump back and we click on a data point, we don't enable cross-filtering by default in Deneb because it requires you as a creator to think about how people are going to use your visual and what it needs to do when stuff is selected. So I'll go turn that on. So we'll turn on cross-filtering, and you'll see what I mean. If I, again, jump back, I'll go to the spec first because it'll come back up when we go back in. I'll jump back to my report, and what I can do is I can click on 12 a.m., and we can see that stuff filtered, but our visual's not doing anything. I can click on 8 a.m. Wednesday. I can even click on a bar, and it highlights all of Wednesday, or I can click on 11 a.m., and it goes across the board. So we know it's cross-filtering, but what's tricky to get across easily is to sort of, if we look at the core bar visual, there's this semi-opaque bar and a solid bar, and these are actually two different shapes. So we need to think about that with our visual design to make sure that we're communicating the right thing to our readers. And as creators, this is one thing that we actually have to do. It's very hard to automate, unfortunately, because it can, there's no real design patterns for some custom visuals. So we need to think about that ourselves a little bit. But what it does do is let you explore potential ideas. So we just added a tooltip to the mark. But what we can also do as creators is we can change that a little bit. And instead of putting true, we can specify content data, which is part of the Vega language. So instead of exposing just the measures and columns, if we hover over 12 a.m. now, and it's quite hard to show you, but we actually have a bunch of internal stuff. So not just the hours and the weekday and the messages and the sentiment, but these things here. And I don't know if I can zoom in, Reed. I'll try. No, it didn't work. So
Yeah,
hopefully that's
it's
going to
hard to do on the tooltip, but yeah, like it's legible. You can see it.
Maybe we can change. Can the tooltip font size change? That might be quite good. Oh, look at that.
There you go.
Everything. Let's try that. Hey, that's better. But the key thing we've got to think about is under the hood, when we do a cross filter, we change the status of a data point to indicate whether it's actually selected or not. So right now, this says neutral. So in Deneb, we expose three values. We expose on, off, or neutral. So right now, there's no selection applied to any of these data points. So they're all neutral. As we scroll through, we see the values change, but all the selected values are neutral. Now, if I click on this top left one, you can see now that this has changed to on. And if I go down to, say, 3 a.m., that's off. So all the individual rows that passed into Power BI are now either on or off because we've clicked on a mark and it has a state. So this is not particularly exciting, but it's something you have to think about. So what we're going to do, we're going to use that field to produce some visual effects. So in our encoding for our main matrix, we've got our X and our Y, which is our position. We've got our fill, which is our color. And just after the fill, we're going to add an opacity encoding. So let's add that in. So what I'm doing is I'm just typing out a condition, which is like an if else. And what we can see is the visual is actually updated because we had that selection on. But let's just talk through what we're doing. So we apply a test and we say the selected field, if it's equal to off, reduce the opacity down to 30%, or basically dim it out. So we can see this is off and it's dim. Otherwise, it's 1 or 100%. So when we go to the Monday 12 a.m., we can see that it's on and it's fully opaque. Now, if I click off, it's now neutral. But because neutral is not off, which is what we've specified here, it falls down to the default value of 100%. So this is a simple condition that we have to put in to say, yes, the field is selected or it isn't. And what that means is you can have different effects for different states. So if it's neutral versus selected, if it's selected, you can actually have a border around it or something like that. You can actually add extra styling to really emphasize it. But for now, we're just worried about off versus everything else. So if I click on my data points, I can now see I get this lovely visual effect. And if we jump out, I can see that it's pretty much doing what I want, and I can control click.
Excellent.
And
multi-select,
things are starting to work. Yeah. Now, these fellows here, we've talked about before, these are an aggregation of many data points. So with Power BI visuals, with interactivity, it's all at the data point level. So that's our lowest level of detail. Now, this works nicely because it's the individual rows that we got in our table, and Power BI can work that out. With these fellows, they are a number of data points squashed down. So we can click on them. And what Deneb does is it actually tries to work it out. So what Deneb does is it works out that for this series, we actually have 7 data points and we select them all at once. So we can see that it's on, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all off. So we've actually built that logic into the visual to help with these situations. So it actually works it out for you, which is quite cool. But it means you still have to do the work to figure out how to make these work. And with these ones, you've got to think about partial shading. So let's jump in. And we'll use the trick we used for each of these marks. So we'll find that's the one we want. We've got our row. So let's just add that tooltip in. And let's do the same with the column. So bearing in mind that this is now telling a tooltip to expose everything it knows about the underlying data point. So this is a bit technical, and I do apologize, but this is part of the reality of building a visual like this.
It's important
So
to
if
learn.
we find our 8am, it is, and you'll see how we can leverage this in just a second. Hopefully, this will all start to click. I hope. So what we can see is because we know this is 8am, and this is saying it's the sum of messages. So what it doesn't have is the row context that these ones have, because it's taken these data points and it's made its own mark. So it doesn't know, without Deneb working it out, which data points are actually making this up. It just knows that it's got a value called sum, and it's for 8am. And when we click on this, Deneb kind of goes back and works out which ones it should select and does that for you. But what we can do is we can use a similar trick to, I guess, what the Power BI, I can't speak for the Microsoft, but those partial highlights are actually 2 rectangles. One is filled and one is not filled in. So we're going to use a trick very similar to that approach. So let's have a think here. What we've got to do is think about when we click on a data point, this is 546 messages, but over here, we've got 4006. So what we need to think about is how many messages are selected versus how many are available. And what we'll do is we'll use a feature of Vega Lite called a transform to help us out. So what transforms are, so when you build a data model in Power BI, you have Power Query, and you can get your data and you can apply logic to it. You can add columns, you can do aggregations, you can pivot, you can unpivot. The Vega languages have exactly the same kind of functionality. It's perhaps not as rich as Power Query, but it does let you do things that you don't need to create measures in your model for. You can just as equally create measures, but sometimes you might need to think about this. So at the top level, what I'm going to do, and we do this at the top level because it can be used all the way through. So we can add transforms all over the place, but we need to think about where they're added. So what I'm doing is I've added in a transform, and it's a calculate. And what this says is for that selected value, and we'll keep this up because it can help us. For this selected value, if it is equal to off, then store a value of 0. Otherwise, use the value of the measure and call it messages selected. So what we have here is we have our messages column, and we have our messages selected column that we've just calculated, and they're the same value, 546. If we hop over to this one, we've got messages 534, but our selected messages are 0. So we already know now that we're counting 0 when this one is 534 if it's unfiltered. So what we can do is we can go down to the row, and if we wanted to, we could change this instead to now be a sum of messages selected, which we calculate. So now you can see I've clicked on this one, and I've got a bar here, but not for anywhere else, which is quite handy, right? And if I click off, I get my bars back. And if I click on, I get my bar. And this is kind of showing us the highlighted amount. So this is half of the puzzle. So what we need to think about now is how we're going to make that work. And what we've got is in this row, we've got a mark called bar. But what we want to think about now is, we've used this technique before, it's called layering. So we're going to create a layer and we're going to move this mark inside it. And this looks basically the same. And I'm just going to do the same thing because we'll have to repeat it down here. Oops. Let's not worry about that just yet. Let's grab that mark and we'll move it in here. And we'll just repair that up. So to all intents and purposes, we've basically got an entry in our layer. And we've got another entry. Whoops, I skipped up a bit too much. We've got another entry here. So what this is saying is draw a rectangle and bind the selected messages number to it. And we'll do the same thing with this one, just so that our columns are consistent as well. We can see that's changed too. So we can click on this and that, whoops, and we get, things grow accordingly. So this is adding up. But what we want to do is remember the original value. So in our row, let's just find that. It's always fun when you start to get around. So this bar is being drawn, and just ahead of that bar, we want to add in another mark that's a bar that uses the same height, and it has a reduced opacity of 30%. And as we go through, we encode in that mark, its X position is the original messages field, and it uses the aggregate as well. So that doesn't make a lot of sense because right now we've got something that looks very much the same as what we had. What happens now, though, is if we click on 11 a.m. Monday, we now get our original mark that we changed gets reduced down because it's still keeping the mark we just drew, which is the semi-opaque one, which is the original value. So now we've got this lovely partial highlight effect. And
yeah, the cross filtering is great.
Yeah, and if we hover over, we now get to see at this level where we had our 514, 514, 5680, 6530, at a group level, we've got a 514 out of 4,540. So it's keeping everything where it needs to be. So I can click on this and this, and we see that nice partial highlight. And now if I click on this, I get my full row, which is exactly what you were looking to do.
Perfect.
But it's just a little thing we have to think about.
Well, and also being able to do it at the cell level is really nice too, to see like as a percentage versus the whole. It shows the scale very well.
It's pretty good. It's a little bit of a dry piece, but it's these little things that when they start to come together, they're quite cool. So let's just do, we'll fix this one up as well. So we've got our, what's important to note, let's just fix up the, let's do the columns too. So we're adding in a mark, same kind of thing. Now with a bit of time, we could probably take some of this out and put it in the config. But just for brevity, because I'm already taking up heaps of your time, Reed. We'll just repeat it. But, now we have the same thing. We've got a nice partial highlighting. So that works quite nicely. So we've now got that working, but we just had to add an extra mark in that sits over the top. And these are drawn in the order in which they appear. So this semi-opaque mark gets drawn first, and then our selected mark gets drawn afterwards. And if they are equal, the fully opaque one just sits over the top. And that's how it works. So what we then need to think about now is we want to do your color. So let's sort that out. We need to make these color based on sentiment. So for each of these layers, so we just want to find in that layer where the Y and the X, so we've got our hours and our messages, we just want to add a color like we did for the heat map. So let's pop that in. So we've got our color and we're binding it to the sentiment field. And we have to remember to use the aggregate because it's this different layer. And we've passed in your colors that you've used in your bars. So a similar thing from min to max, it runs from this to this. And we will do the same thing with the, and because these are different charts effectively, each one of these is a chart within the same view, we've got to do the coloring down here as well. Agreed. So we'll find our columns and we'll apply that too. So let's just whack that in. We could have probably just copy pasted it, but never mind. So what's noticeable though is this one's now changed. And the reason is because these are higher values than these. And it's because we're using the color scale across the chart in two places, but it tries to normalize it so that it's consistent.
Hmm.
So what we need to do at the top level, I'll just jump up here. Much like we did with the transform, I'm just going to add in something called resolve. And what this does is it says for the color scale, make them independent. So this, if you think about charts, this could be, if you've got two charts the same next to each other in a Vega light view, the y-axis could be in sync, and we could use a technique like this to split them and make them different. You may not want to do that, but this is just a way of unsynchronizing the color binding so that they actually work across the range of values. So now we've got something that's a little bit more intuitive for each one of those levels.
Perfect.
And then the other thing we want to look at is our tooltips. So right now, these are a little bit, they're not great. But what we did is we basically turned on a debugging function to expose some of that stuff. And our readers don't care about that. So with our tooltip, what we'll just do is change that back to true. And now that's just a little bit more readable. And we'll do the same thing with the other ones. So we'll go back to our, that's the wrong bar. That's our row. It's hidden in there. So pass that out there. Tooltip true, and we will do that one too. And now when we hover over the tooltips, we've got something that's a little more sensible. The other thing we perhaps want to do, what we can do is make the tooltips a bit more sensible. Because right now, if we click on this and we hover over that one, we've kind of got a bunch of stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense because, again, it makes sense to us, but to our readers, we want to help them a bit. So we can actually add an encoding channel to tooltips as well. So if we look at our main matrix is okay, but if we look at our row, in addition to the Y, the X, and the color, we can actually add a tooltip encoding. Just scroll down a bit to have a bit more room. And we can pass in a list of entries here. And what this is going to do, if we don't want to use things like report page tooltips, we can actually override the tooltip details. So what we've done here is we've got 3 entries. We've got our hours of our hours, and we've renamed that as well. So instead of it saying hours AM PM, we say time of day. We've got our messages, and we just use the aggregate against so the number's right. And then we add in our selected messages, and we call that highlighted. So if we hover over here now, we've got time of day, sum of messages, and messages highlighted. But one other thing we can do with Vega is because Vega starts to, by default, it's helpful by putting in these aggregates. We don't necessarily want that. Now, I could do a title, which I've done here, or I can actually come into the config and I can just specify field title plain. And what that does is that tells Vega Lite to strip off the helpful aggregate stuff. So if I now go over here, it just says messages, which is a little more readable, which is quite nice. So let's just fix up our other one. So we can do the same thing with our columns. You know, we've got the same kind of issue here. So for brevity, we'll just hit that up. So just typing those in, same kind of thing. The only difference now is we've got our weekday short and we've renamed that to day of week. And we hover over here. And the last little thing, and this I promise is the last thing, and this is just a polished thing, is you see our messages highlighted. We've been able to take the formatting from our data model for messages, which has a little comma in. But for highlighted, because that's worked out within Vega Lite, we don't know what that is. So we can actually add in, and we've used previous videos, the formatter. So we can just pass in a format string using the Power BI formatter and just make that a slightly better format. And we'll do the same thing just up here for our other one. So we've got our format type, format 0. Hover over here. We've now got messages and highlighted messages that basically look consistent with each other. Tidy that up because I'm a tidy person, and then back to the
Perfect.
report. And there you go. It only took us a little while to do that. Um, but now we have a visual that works really nicely. So I can click on my data points just like we do, just like we want to, I should say, and I can
Hmm.
hover over here, and I've got my nice information in my tooltip.
Yeah, and I mean, it gives all the cuts of the data, and I think like especially with the cross filter, and I think that's a huge and powerful insight tool that's built into Power BI to give you the subtotals versus whole that you can look at. So I think all of this combined provides a great visual, and I think it showcases the additional features that can be caked in when you have a single visual doing all of this interaction versus you know doing something that works well enough between layered visuals, but due to certain product limitations doesn't have necessarily all of the features that you want. So I'm glad that there's a lot of like net add in using this custom version for sure. And I'll definitely be swapping the combo chart three layered visual that I have in the Google Analytics report out for this because it's just a much better version of it.
No, I mean, that's really exciting. And this has the
Yeah,
benefit of being a certified visual. So it should just look part of a report if you generate a PDF. So yeah, I mean, it's
exactly.
taken us a little while to get there, but we did do some pretty advanced stuff. But hopefully, this
Hmm.
gives you some stuff. If you like Deneb and are interested in Deneb and want to do more with it, this should hopefully expose a little bit more of how to approach a visual from the ground up, particularly when it comes to interactivity. So we spent a lot of time on that, but it is something you have to think about. And for
Yeah.
somebody that used the visuals for so many years before developing their own, you do take a lot of it for granted. And we've done quite a
Yeah.
bit in Deneb to abstract some of that up into, that if you thought this was tricky, doing it at a pure custom visual level can be quite challenging too. So we'll
Yeah, I
keep
mean,
we'll
like
keep
we did in an
working.
hour, hour and 15 minutes that otherwise would take a custom app developer like a couple of days at least to build this out. So it
Yeah,
is very
I
layered,
think
but it's because we added so many features. This wasn't just display it, but this is also providing the cross filtering and the highlighting and all of these little things. And with the bespoke visual creator, each time you want a new feature, there's usually not just a checkbox to turn it on. It does need to be coded in, but it just shows you
yeah,
that as long as you can have an idea in there and that it's possible within the feature set for in this case Vega Lite, then it's just something that can be added. So I think this is a great example of a bit of a deeper dive, but really showcasing a lot of unique features and things that it can do that even combined native visuals necessarily can't.
yeah, absolutely. And the thing is now, I mean, this took a bit of time, but unless days of the week change or hours of the day change, this should just work in
Yeah.
perpetuity now.
Exactly. I mean, all you have to do is drop the fields in, and then use the wells and basically populate it with the data for either for the subtotals, totals, and then color formatted and everything else. So it's now like with anything in Deneb, once it's made, if it's interchangeable data sets, then it's now a template that can be reused over and over again, and just
That's
tweaked
right.
slightly as needed for size and scale.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've really enjoyed putting this together. It was a really good challenge to solve, and it's one that we can obviously, hopefully, now drop right into a pretty insightful report. So really happy.
Perfect. And thank you for doing this, Daniel. And again, I love uh, the upgraded professionalism of all of those little macros that allowed you just to script it out stuff out really fast. I mean, I know
Yeah.
I copy paste from a OneNote when I do that stuff, but having it actually typed out at like an increased speed without needing to tweak that was really useful. So I think this will further
Yeah.
help
It's
additional videos like this.
yeah, it's very very handy. So I've got to really tip my hat to Ben Ferry, the Power BI guy, who got me into that. He's using Deneb quite a lot, and he's been sharing some of his productivity tips. And I very much like Reed would copy paste things, but it takes a little bit more effort to get things ready from my end. But it's a lot nicer to be able to talk and make some mistakes. You can probably tell the bits that I'm typing manually versus not. But it does make for a. We took a lot of time today, but it would take a lot
Mhm.
longer if I was typing out for
And for
sure.
people tuning in, by the time this video comes out, Ben will have been on my channel a couple of weeks prior doing a live stream. He did one on buttons and visualization, which was, I will say, speaking now from the future perspective, I'm sure it was a great session that he had. So I will encourage you to check that out on the channel. But for Daniel stuff, check out his, all the Deneb links will be in the description down below, as well as an option to, ping him on Twitter or LinkedIn. And you can also check out the embedded version of this visual as well in my Google Analytics report that will also be included in the description link. So play around with it, and like I encourage you, if you at all write custom visuals, check out Deneb. It is, it's the best bespoke visual creator on the market at the moment for Power BI.
Awesome.
Yeah, Daniel, enjoy the rest of your morning, and I'll have you on again next time.
Yeah, I would love to come back as always. Keep those challenges coming, Reid.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Please don't forget to like, comment, or share this video. Now, if this is your first time to my channel, or you want to see more of these awesome videos, please click that subscribe and notification button. Also, feel free to show your support by becoming a channel member. Last but not least, you can download the file for today's video from my blog files page using the link down below. So until next time.